Chapter 1. History of my religious opinions to the year 1833, Part 2. In the beginning of 1829 came the formal break between Dr. Whately and me. The fear of Mr. Peel's re-election was the occasion of it. I think in 1828 or 1827 I had voted in the minority, when the petition to Parliament against the Catholic claims was brought into convocation. I did so mainly on the views suggested to me in the letters of an Episcopalian. Also I shrank from the bigoted two-bottle orthodox, as they were individually called. When then I took part against Mr. Peel, it was on an academical, not at all an ecclesiastical or a political ground, and this I professed at the time. I considered that Mr. Peel had taken the University by surprise, that his friends had no right to call upon us to turn round on a sudden, and to expose ourselves to the imputation of time-serving, and that a great University ought not to be bullied, even by a great Duke of Wellington. Also, by this time, I was under the influence of Keble and Froude, who, in addition to the reason I have given, disliked the Duke's change of policy, as dictated by Liberalism. Whately was considerably annoyed at me, and he took a humorous revenge, of which he had given me due notice beforehand. As head of a house, he had duties of hospitality to men of all parties. He asked a set of the least intellectual men in Oxford to dinner, and men most fond of port. He made me one of his party, placed me between Provost this and Principal that, and then asked me if I was proud of my friends. However, he had a serious meaning in his act. He saw more clearly than I could do that I was separating from his own friends for good and all. Dr. Whately attributed my leaving his clientela to a wish on my part to be the head of a party myself. I do not think that this charge was deserved. My habitual feeling then and since has been that it was not I who sought friends, but friends who sought me. Never man had kinder or more indulgent friends than I have had, but I express my own feelings as to the mode in which I gained them. In this very year 1829, in the course of a copy of verses. Speaking of my blessings, I said, "Blessings of friends, which to my door unasked, unhoped, have come. They have come, they have gone, they came to my great joy, they went to my great grief. He who gave took away." Dr. Whately's impression about me, however, admits of this explanation. During the first years of my residence at Oriel, though proud of my college, I was not quite at home there. I was very much alone, and I used often to take daily walks by myself. I recollect once meeting Dr. Copleston, then Provost, with one of the Fellows. He turned round, and with a kind courteousness, which sat so well on him, made me a bow, and said, "Nunquam minus solus, quam cum solus." At that time, indeed, from 1823, I had the intimacy of my dear and true friend, Dr. Pusey, and could not fail to admire and revere a soul so devoted to the cause of religion, so full of good works, so faithful in his affections. But he left residence when I was getting to know him well. As to Dr. Whately himself, he was too much my superior to allow of my being at my ease with him, and to no one in Oxford at this time did I open my heart fully and familiarly. But things changed in 1826. At that time I became one of the tutors of my college, and this gave me position. Besides, I had written one or two essays, which had been well received. I began to be known. I preached my first University sermon. Next year I was one of the public examiners for the B.A. degree. In 1828 I became Vicar of St. Mary's. It was to me like the feeling of spring weather after winter, and, if I may so speak, I came out of my shell. I remained out of it till 1841. The two persons who knew me best at that time are still alive, beneficed clergymen, no longer my friends. They could tell better than any one else what I was in those years. From this time my tongue was, as it were, loosened, and I spoke spontaneously and without effort. One of the two, Mr. Rickards, said of me, I have been told, "Here is a fellow who, when he is silent, will never begin to speak, and when he once begins to speak, will never stop." It was at this time that I began to have influence, which steadily increased for a course of years. I gained upon my pupils, and was in particular intimate and affectionate with two of our probationer fellows, Robert Isaac Wilberforce, afterwards Archdeacon, and Richard Hurrell Froude. Whately then, an acute man, perhaps saw around me the signs of an incipient party, of which I was not conscious myself, and thus we discerned the first element of that movement afterwards called Tractarian. The true and primary author of it, however, as is usual with great motive powers, was out of sight. Having carried off as a mere boy the highest honours of the University, he had turned from the admiration which haunted his steps, and sought for a better and holier satisfaction in pastoral work in the country. Need I say that I am speaking of John Keble? The first time that I was in a room with him was an occasion of my election to a fellowship at Oriel, when I was sent for into the Tower, to shake hands with the Provost and Fellows. How is that hour fixed in my memory after the changes of 42 years? 42 this very day of which I write. I have lately had a letter in my hand, which I sent at the time to my great friend John William Bowden, with whom I passed almost exclusively my undergraduate years. I had to hasten to the Tower, I say to him, to receive the congratulations of all the Fellows. I bore it till Keble took my hand, and then felt so abashed and unworthy of the honour done me, that I seemed desirous of quite sinking into the ground. His had been the first name which I had heard spoken of, with reverence rather than admiration, when I came to Oxford. When one day I was walking in High Street, with my dear earliest friend just mentioned, with what eagerness did he cry out, "There's Keble!" and with what awe did I look at him! Then at another time I heard a Master of Arts of my college give an account how he had just then had occasion to introduce himself on some business to Keble, and how gentle, courteous, and unaffected Keble had been, so as almost to put him out of countenance. Then too it was reported, truly or falsely, how a rising man of brilliant reputation, the present Dean of St. Paul's, Dr. Newman, admired and loved him, adding that somehow he was strangely unlike any one else. However, at the time when I was elected Fellow of Oriel, he was not in residence, and he was shy of me for years in consequence of the marks which I bore upon me of the evangelical and liberal schools. At least so I have ever thought. Hurrell Froude brought us together about 1828. It is one of the sayings preserved in his remains. Do you know the story of the murderer who had done one good thing in his life? Well, if I was ever asked what good deed I had ever done, I should say that I had brought Keble and Newman to understand each other. The Christian year made its appearance in 1827. It is not necessarily and scarcely becoming to praise a book which has already become one of the classics of the language. When the general tone of religious literature was so nerveless and impotent as it was at that time, Keble struck an original note and woke up in the hearts of thousands a new music, the music of a school long unknown in England. Nor can I pretend to analyze in my own instance the effect of religious teaching so deep, so pure, so beautiful. I have never till now tried to do so, yet I think I am not wrong in saying that the two main intellectual truths which it brought home to me were the same two which I had learned from Butler, though recast in the creative mind of my new master. The first of those was what may be called, in a large sense of the word, the sacramental system, that is, the doctrine that material phenomena are both the types and instruments of real things unseen, a doctrine which embraces in its fullness not only what Anglicans as well as Catholics believe about sacraments properly so called, but also the article of the communion of saints, and likewise the mysteries of the faith. The connection of this philosophy of religion with what is sometimes called Berkeleyism has been mentioned above. I knew little of Berkeley at this time, except by name, nor have I ever studied him. On the second intellectual principle which I gained from Mr. Keble, I could say a great deal, if this were the place for it. It runs through very much that I have written, and has gained for me many hard names. Butler teaches us that probability is the guide of life. The danger of this doctrine, in the case of many minds, is its tendency to destroy in them absolute certainty, leading them to consider every conclusion as doubtful, and resolving truth into an opinion, which it is safe indeed to obey or to profess, but not possible to embrace with full internal assent. If this were to be allowed, then the celebrated saying, "O God, if there be a God, save my soul, if I have a soul," would be the highest measure of devotion. But who can really pray to a being, about whose existence he is seriously in doubt? I consider that Mr. Keble met this difficulty by ascribing the firmness of assent which we give to religious doctrine, not to the probabilities which introduce it, but to the living power of faith and love, which accepted it. In matters of religion, he seemed to say, it is not merely probability which makes us intellectually certain, but probability as it is put to account by faith and love. It is faith and love which give to probability a force which it has not in itself. Faith and love are directed towards an object. In the vision of that object they live. It is that object, received in faith and love, which renders it reasonable to take probability as sufficient for internal conviction. Thus the argument from probability in the matter of religion became an argument from personality, which in fact is one form of the argument from authority. In illustration, Mr. Keble used to quote the words of the Psalm, "I will guide thee with mine eye, but ye not like to horse and mule, which have no understanding, whose mouth must be held with bit and bridle, lest they fall upon thee." This is the very difference he used to say between slaves and friends or children. Friends do not ask for literal commands, but from their knowledge of the speaker they understand his half-words, and from love of him they anticipate his wishes. Hence it is that in the poem of St. Bartholomew's Day he speaks of the eye of God Word, and in the note from Mr. Miller of Worcester College, who remarks in his Bampton Lectures on the special power of Scripture as having this eye like that of a portrait, uniformly fixed upon us, turn where we will. The view thus suggested by Mr. Keble is brought forward in one of the earliest of the Tracts for Our Times. In number 8, I say, "The Gospel is a law of liberty. We are treated as sons, not as servants, not subjected to a code of formal commandments, but addressed as those who love God and wish to please Him." I did not at all dispute this view of the matter, for I made use of it myself, but I was dissatisfied because it did not go to the root of the difficulty. It was beautiful and religious, but it did not even profess to be logical, and accordingly I tried to complete it by considerations of my own, which are to be found in my University Sermons, Essays on Ecclesiastical Miracles, and Essays on Development of Doctrine. My argument is in outline as follows: that absolute certitude which we are able to possess, whether as to the truth of natural theology or as to the fact of a revelation, was the result of an assemblage of concurring and converging probabilities, and that both according to the constitution of the human mind and the will of its Maker, that certitude was a habit of mind, that certainty was a quality of propositions, that probability which did not reach to logical certainty might suffice for mental certitude, that the certitude thus brought about might equal in measure and strength the certitude which was created by the strictest scientific demonstration, and that to possess such certitude might in given cases and to given individuals be a plain duty, though not to others in other circumstances. Moreover, that as there were probabilities which sufficed for certitude, so there were other probabilities which were legitimately adapted to create opinion, that it might be quite as much a matter of duty in given cases and to given persons to have about a fact an opinion of a definite strength and consistency, as in the case of greater or of more numerous probabilities it was a duty to have a certitude; that accordingly we were bound to be more or less sure on a sort of, as it were, graduated scale of assent, namely, according as the probability attaching to a professed fact were brought home to us, and as the case might be, to entertain about it a pious belief, or a pious opinion, or a religious conjecture, or at least a tolerance of such belief, or opinion, or conjecture in others. That, on the other hand, as it was a duty to have a belief, of more or less strong texture, in given cases, so in other cases it was a duty not to believe, not to opine, not to conjecture, not even to tolerate the notion that a professed fact was true, inasmuch as it would be credulity, or superstition, or some other moral fault to do so. This was the region of private judgment in religion, that is, of a private judgment not formed arbitrarily and according to one's fancy or liking, but conscientiously and under a sense of duty. Considerations such as these throw a new light on the subject of miracles, and they seem to have led me to reconsider the view which I had taken of them in my essay in 1825-1826. I do not know what was the date of this change in me, nor of the train of ideas on which it was founded. That there had been already great miracles, as those of Scriptures, as the resurrection, was a fact establishing the principle that the laws of nature had sometimes been suspended by their divine Author, and since what had happened once might happen again, a certain probability, at least no kind of improbability, was attached to the idea taken in itself, of miraculous intervention in later times, and miraculous accounts were to be regarded in connection with the verisimilitude, scope, instrument, character, testimony, and circumstances with which they presented themselves to us. And, according to the final results of those various considerations, it was our duty to be sure, or to believe, or to opine, or to surmise, or to tolerate, or to reject, or to denounce. The main difference between my essay on miracles in 1826 and my essay in 1842 is this, that in 1826 I considered that miracles were sharply divided into two classes, those which were to be received and those which were to be rejected, whereas in 1842 I saw that they were to be regarded according to their greater or lesser probability, which was in some cases sufficient to create certitude about them, in other cases only belief or opinion. Moreover, the argument from analogy, on which this view of the question was founded, suggested to me something besides in recommendation of the ecclesiastical miracles. It fastened itself upon the theory of church history, which I had learned as a boy from Joseph Milner. It is Milner's doctrine that upon the visible church come down from above, at certain intervals, large and temporary effusions of divine grace. This is the leading idea of his work. He begins by speaking of the day of Pentecost, as marking the first of those effusions of the Spirit of God, which from age to age have visited the earth since the coming of Christ. Volume I, page 3. In a note he adds that in the term effusion there is not here included the idea of the miraculous or extraordinary operations of the Spirit of God. But still it was natural for me, admitting Milner's general theory, and applying it to the principle of analogy, not to stop short at his abrupt ipse dixit, but boldly to pass forward to the conclusion, on other grounds plausible, that as miracles accompany the first diffusion of grace, so they might accompany the latter. It is surely a natural and on the whole a true anticipation, though of course there are exceptions in particular cases, that gifts and graces go together. Now, according to the ancient Catholic doctrine, the gift of miracles was viewed as the attendant and shadow of transcendent sanctity, and moreover, since such sanctity was not of every day's occurrence, nay further, since one period of Church history differed widely from another, and, as Joseph Milner would say, there have been generations or centuries of degeneracy or disorder, and times of revival, and since one region might be in the midday of religious fervour, and another in twilight or gloom, there was no force in the popular argument that, because we did not see miracles with our own eyes, miracles had not happened in former times, or were not now at this very time taking place in distant places. But I must not dwell longer on a subject to which in a few words it is impossible to do justice. Hurrell Froude was a pupil of Kebles, formed by him and in turn reacting upon him. I knew him first in 1826 and was in the closest and most affectionate friendship with him from about 1829 till his death in 1836. He was a man of the highest gifts, so truly many-sided, that it would be presumptuous in me to attempt to describe him except under those aspects in which he came before me. Nor have I here to speak of the gentleness and tenderness of nature, the playfulness, the free elastic forces and graceful versatility of mind, and the patient winning considerateness in discussion, which endeared him to those to whom he opened his heart. For I am all along engaged upon matters of belief and opinion, and am introducing others into my narrative, not for their own sake or because I love and have loved them, so much as because and so far as they have influenced my theological views. In this respect, then, I speak of Hurrell Froude in his intellectual aspect, as a man of high genius, brimful and overflowing with ideas and views, in him original, which were too many and strong even for his bodily strength, and which crowded and jostled against each other in their effort after distinct shape and expression. And he had an intellect as critical and logical as it was speculative and bold. Dying prematurely as he did, and in the conflict and transition state of opinion, his religious views never reached their ultimate conclusion, by the very reason of their multitude and their depth. His opinions arrested and influenced me even when they did not gain my assent. He professed openly his admiration of the Church of Rome, and his hatred of the Reformers. He delighted in the notion of a hierarchical system, of sacerdotal power, and of full ecclesiastical liberty. He felt scorn of the maxim, "The Bible and the Bible only is the religion of Protestants," and he gloried in accepting tradition as a main instrument of religious teaching. He had a high, severe idea of the intrinsic excellence of virginity, and he considered the Blessed Virgin its great pattern. He delighted in thinking of the saints. He had a vivid appreciation of the idea of sanctity, its possibilities and its heights, and he was more than inclined to believe a large amount of miraculous interference as occurring in the early and Middle Ages. He embraced the principle of penance and mortification. He had a deep devotion to the real presence in which he had a firm faith. He was powerfully drawn to the medieval church, but not to the primitive. He had a keen insight into abstract truths, but he was an Englishman to the backbone in his severe adherence to the real and the concrete. He had a most classical taste and a genius for philosophy and art, and he was fond of a historical inquiry and the politics of religion. He had no turn for theology as such. He set no sufficient value on the writings of the Fathers, on the detail or development of doctrine, on the definite traditions of the Church viewed in their matter, on the teachings of the ecumenical councils, or on the controversies out of which they arose. He took an eager, courageous view of things on the whole. I should say that his power of entering into the minds of others did not equal his other gifts. He could not believe, for instance, that I really held the Roman Church to be anti-Christian. On many points he would not believe but that I agreed with him, when I did not. He seemed not to understand my difficulties. His were of a different kind, the contrariety between theory and fact. He was a high Tory of the Cavalier stamp, and was disgusted with the Toryism of the opponents of the Reform Bill. He was smitten with the love of the theocratic Church. He went abroad and was shocked by the degeneracy which he thought he saw in the Catholics of Italy. It is difficult to enumerate the precise additions to my theological creed which I derived from a friend to whom I owe so much. He taught me to look with admiration towards the Church of Rome, and in the same degree to dislike the Reformation. He fixed deep in me the idea of devotion to the Blessed Virgin, and he led me gradually to believe in the real presence.